So good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's edition of 120 Dublin Stories with Santa Rita and the Little Museum. As our guest this evening, I'm really delighted to be joined by Fionnuala Croke, the director of the Chester Beatty. I've been a huge fan since childhood, so I'm really very much looking forward to the conversation this evening. So Fionnuala, thank you so much for being here.
It's a great pleasure. I'm looking forward to this. Thanks, Sarah.
Very happily. It's as we're going through the evening, if anyone has questions for Fionnuala, please do type them in and we will very happily make our way through them. But I'm going to jump in and just ask you a question and start us off. So sure. Obviously it is called the Chester Beatty. Why don't you just introduce us to Sir Chester Beatty himself?
So Alfred Chester Beatty, known as Chester Beatty, he just was an extraordinary man. And of course, we know him in Dublin best as a great collector, somebody who assembled one of the finest, if not the finest collection of its kind in the 20th century, a private library of manuscripts and rare books and decorative objects. But, you know, he was a great mining engineer initially, and became a really important businessman of his generation. He set up a company that became a multinational with interests across the world, mining interests across the globe. And let's not forget also that he was a great philanthropist as well. In his lifetime, of course, we know him for the great gift of the Chester Beatty collection to the people of Ireland, but he was a great philanthropist as well.
And is he from Ireland himself, or what's his connection to Ireland?
No, he's American. He was born in New York, but the Irish connection is quite strong. Both his father's parents were from Ireland. In fact, his father's mother was a lady called Catherine Louisa Armstrong from Mountrath, County Laois, where my own dad is from. So I like to think that's a bit of serendipity. So his father's father was also, you know, there's mixed, was he Scottish or was he Irish? But it would seem that he was actually Irish. And both of them, indeed, are buried in Armagh.
Oh, okay. So yeah. Quite up the road. And then, you know, tell me a little bit about the scope of his collection in terms of the scale of what he was actually interested in.
Yeah, so he seems to have been collecting from a young man. I mean, in fact, we know he was collecting as a child. We know he was collecting little bits of precious rock and stone as a young boy. And odds and ends, different little things that attracted him. But as a young mining engineer in New York, we don't know that much about his earliest serious adult collecting, but we know he was collecting some European illuminated manuscripts. What's really curious is a reference to the fact that he was buying some leaves of a Persian Shahnameh, or the Persian Book of Kings. It's a little more unusual. So around 1907, 1908, we're talking about in New York. And he was already then interested in Chinese snuff bottles, which would be a great interest for him throughout his life. We've about 900 today in the collection, but I think he had double that amount at one time. And also little Japanese netsuke, Inro and Suba. So he already had a variety of interest from an early stage.
Okay.
Yeah. Will I keep going? Because yeah, just to let you know, he moves to London from New York, and we can talk about why if you have time. But he moves to London about 1913. He was traveling back and forth over the years, but he buys a house in London, and he settles there. And his collecting really starts in earnest. He already had amassed quite a fortune by about 1908. He had been working for the Guggenheim Exploration Company, assessing mines for them, and made a lot of money doing that. So moves to London and sets up his own company called Selection Trust. And after the First World War, that company is increasingly successful with mining interests around the world. And also then he's just really making very judicious stock market investments. So he has the resources necessary to buy the very best. And his focus is always on quality and rarity.
Okay, that was actually a question I was about to ask you. I always find it fascinating when you meet collectors to kind of really dig down and understand what their motives are and how they actually select the pieces that they're going to go on to acquire.
And, Beatty doesn't tell us very much. We don't have very much from him saying why what motivated and what really drove him to collect. But he was obviously innately a collector, as I say, from a child, really. And I suppose what was really nice for him was as a person of private means, able to buy whatever he wanted at whatever time he wanted. And his tastes they really expanded and became more sophisticated, I think you could say, through the decades. Okay. Because he was collecting right up until his death, right up into the 1960s he was collecting. So that's really spanning. We started in about 1907 we started. So that's a long time. That's, a good stretch of the 20th century. But we do know that he had this great emphasis on quality, by which, he meant intrinsic quality, rarity, and also good condition. So the Chester Beatty collection is a collection that's in generally good condition.
Which is, I would say, envied by a lot of museums across the world. It's and it's an amazing thing, though. It sounds like there's a relatively small ego in the man that you're talking about, because so little about his own personal motives are actually known in the collections.
Well, I can say that there are quite a few references, particularly in I think maybe in latter days when he's living in Ireland and he's dealing with Irish authorities and maybe good old Irish wit saying it, but there's quite a few references to, he likes to be flattered. Well, who doesn't like to be flattered? And particularly, I'm sure, men of a certain position in society like him, of a certain wealth and status. But whatever ego he may or may not have had, there's no doubt he was a really highly astute, shrewd, intelligent man with a great deal of emotional intelligence as well. Because, we could say, if we think about him either as a businessman on an international level or as a collector, they're very similar qualities that he brings to both. So what made him really successful as a chair of this large company with all these interests was that he really believed in paying for the best employees. He got the highest most skilled staff. And then he was happy to delegate to them and give them the responsibility they needed to do their job. And he really had undoubtedly an ability to win the loyalty and affection of those who worked for him. And often people stayed with him for decades and decades throughout their lifetime and his. And similarly with the collecting, he used the skills of specialists to give him advice, and of agents around the world to advise him on buying things. But he did use his own eye ultimately, and he liked to make his own final judgment. He always said, "I'm not a scholar. I'm not a great academic." But there's no doubt he read his way around any subject he was interested in. Yeah.
I believe that he does sound like an exceptional person. And one thing that you mentioned to me in conversation earlier this week that absolutely staggered me, and it was probably because I just had never stepped back to think about it. In my assumption, the Chester Beatty collection in its entirety was what you have within your collection there in Dublin Castle, and I was sorely wrong about that fact.
Yes, and it's interesting to think about. I've thought about this over the years. So what I was referring to there was that what we hold today in the Chester Beatty is what was his private library, and what we would today refer to as the museum, because of course our focus is on displaying and interpreting and using the space as a sort of a very welcoming, vibrant space for our visitors. But he also, for example, collected what was referred to as Oriental weaponry, which he gifted to the Minister of Defence in the 1950s, a trainer, I think it was, and that's in the Curragh Museum, Military Museum. But particularly, he and his second wife, Edith, created a collection of Impressionist and Post-Impressionist paintings that rivaled the Courtauld collection. It was an extraordinary collection. And that all some of it stayed with the family, but most of it was sold off and dispersed, and much of it's back in the States. And in fact, there isn't a major museum in the States that you can name, really, that doesn't have a painting with a Beatty provenance. MoMA, the Met, St. Louis Museum, Houston, Norton Simon, just keep going, and there are paintings there with and the very sad thing about that, of course, is that Beatty had hoped to leave those to the National Gallery of Ireland, but his wife remained in London when he moved to Dublin in 1950, and she died intestate, and he had huge death duties to pay. And he started to realize that he'd have to sell off the works to pay the death duties, and also then they were making huge amounts of money. And he was investing huge amounts of money in Ireland, in Dublin, to build his own library, the original location that you remember out in Shrewsbury Road. So
actually, that's a nice segue back to it. So talk to me about Chester Beatty Library when it was being set up originally. You know, what were the intentions in the beginning, and what was the library like out in Shrewsbury Road? So
in the late 40s, Beatty was thinking of the move, and he was a sort of 74, 75. So this was a really big move to make. London, okay, he had a home in Egypt and he traveled a lot, but London was his base since 1913. So he was already looking to Ireland, and he sort of sounded out the waters at diplomatic, at sort of official government level. How would it be if he were to come and bring his collection with him is the big thing, really bring the collection with him. And with a view to establishing a museum is what he wrote at the time. So already in the 1949, before he moved to Dublin in 1950, he had already hired the architects to do the drawings for Shrewsbury Road. He'd already set upon Shrewsbury Road as the location. So he bought a house in Aylesbury Road, and then he bought the site around the corner in Shrewsbury Road. And in August 53, the Chester Beatty Library opened on that site. First for friends and scholars, but very quickly, within a year, really, he was opening to the public as well.
And talk to me a little bit about, how the early years went and how it kind of evolved to come to the point where the conversation started about moving to your new and current home.
Well, jumping forward to that, really, already before Beatty had already sort of built on extra parts to the original library. He wanted to have an exhibition area, and in his will as well, he established a trust so that the collection is vested in the board of trustees that we have today, who still run the museum. But on the understanding that it would be supported by the state. And that is the way we operate today, with the very welcome grant from the government. What did you specifically ask me there? Say it to me again, Sarah. How did we move to the current location? I suppose over the years, Beatty died in 68, and it officially, the collection moved over, as I say, to this trust. And the collection was getting visitors, but also very importantly, and what Beatty had always wanted, scholars, international scholars, coming through his lifetime and after, and to this day, coming from all over the world to study and work on the collections. But there were very few visitors in Shrewsbury Road. There really were in the low thousands of visitors. I suppose maybe it was a little bit out of the way. And I think the buildings just weren't bearing up so well. And there were concerns about security. There were just many, many concerns at the time. And the trustees did their due diligence. They looked at various potential sites in Dublin, and the Clock Tower building in Dublin Castle was the site they fixed on. And here we are now, nestled in the centre, in a city centre location. And OPW built the gallery block, the modern gallery block, onto the back of the Clock Tower building. And suddenly then, from Shrewsbury Road, from, 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 visitors a year, well, I think they thought, when they saw really the size and the generous spaces of Dublin Castle location, they thought if they ever got to 100,000 visitors, that would really be something. But we're now averaging, in the last number of years, about 350, 360,000 visitors a year. And the number is growing. Last year was our highest visitor numbers, with 370,000. This year will probably be our lowest with COVID, but I know we share that. We're in good company in that regard.
Yeah, I think collectively all of our institutions may meet your numbers from last year, but that's is where we are. Okay, so then, you know, as director of the Chester Beatty, you know, I'd love to see the collection through your eyes a little bit, and just, you know, could you tell me a little bit about some of the pieces that, you know, I guess are front and center in your mind when you think of your collection?
Sure, and that's probably hard enough to do when I'm not showing you images of it. And I know some people listening in, some people this evening will be very familiar with the collection. But, you know, if I say we started off, I mentioned sort of already he had these diverse interests as a young man in New York, and then he started collecting really in serious when he was in London and had more time and resources available to him. We credit a trip to Egypt in 1914 is sort of widely credited. It was a family visit to Egypt, and particularly to Cairo. We really credit that with sort of really sparking this interest, which becomes a huge fascination with him for Islamic material. That's the first thing we can say. And there are many really important pieces in the collection that were bought on visits to Cairo, because he started to winter in Cairo. He developed silicosis of the lungs from scrambling up and down the mines as a young man, and this really scared him. It was one of the big wake-up calls he had in around 1910, 1911 in New York, and then his first wife died as well. So this was another reason just to explain the move with his two young children to London. So he marries again, and they go their first family visit with his second wife is to Cairo. And in Cairo, he has a number of advisors. So he starts buying really extraordinary Qurans there. So, for example, and then on one journey back in the 1920s, he starts to winter every winter in Cairo. And he goes on to build a villa there on an estate. So right up to the Second World War, he's going every year for several months to Cairo. On the way back, I think I'm going to guess 1928 is in my mind, he stops off in Istanbul. And at that time, he buys, we believe, the Rutsbahan Quran, which of all the Qurans we have, is possibly the most highly illuminated. And I mentioned that because we had an exhibition called Lapis and Gold a few years ago. We conserved the Quran, and it was disbound. And while it was disbound, we took advantage of that fact to be able to show the folios separately. And it's it's important historically, but it's also just so visually impressive. That has been rebound now. And it was also there that it came to his attention that there was material available to acquire, which was early biblical papyrus material. And that was bought in the late 20s and published in 1931. And that transpired to be one of the most important collections of early Christian manuscripts in existence, and includes, for example, and sometimes, usually when I say this, there are people who aren't aware that in Dublin we have this, but if you think that from the early centuries of Christianity, there are only about 50 manuscripts known or to survive. And he acquired 11 of these manuscripts in codex or early book form. And they're really substantial parts of the codices that he acquired. And included in them is the earliest undeniable codex of the four Gospels bound together. And the earliest almost complete letters of St. Paul. And both of those date to about 200 to 250 AD. So this was also materially acquired in Egypt. In 1917, he was recovering from the Spanish flu and pneumonia. So the rest of us might be staying at home, but he had spent the winter of 1916 in bed, and his doctors told him to take a long sea voyage. And he traveled to East Asia and spent time, particularly in Japan, stopped off in Shanghai, but also spent a number of months in Japan. And at that time started to acquire really in earnest Chinese and Japanese painting, Buddhist materials. And the Chester Beatty is also very well known for its Japanese scrolls, painted scrolls, Nara Ihon scrolls and painted books. And he bought many of them at this time. On that trip, he started to buy sort of the nucleus of those as well. And right then throughout his life, to say he's buying, and his taste, as I said, because he was a private collector who could just, follow where his instincts took him, and often he had exceptional instincts. It wasn't just exceptional Islamic and East Asian material, but he's buying European illuminated manuscripts. And I could mention the extraordinary Rosarium that was commissioned, if not by Emperor Charles V, by his son Philip II, the King of Spain. that wonderful rosarium is something very special. And he's also acquiring, you know, Armenian material, Burmese, Thai manuscripts. The exhibition before the one that's on at the moment was Thai Buddhist tales, and we had numerous scholars who came over to speak for that in the days when people could come over and speak to us. And you know, one after another, they said, you know, outside of Thailand, this really has to be the most important collection of Thai manuscripts. And you know, we hear that time and again, and it's nicer, obviously, when other people say it, not me, but it's time and again, I can't emphasize enough the quality and importance of the material that Beatty collated.
It's no, it's an amazing thing, and it's quite a probably an impossible challenge to ask you to kind of give us a snapshot of that.
Well, another thing I can mention, and something I know that's close to your own heart, is the little beautiful little pagoda of the Dharani of the 1 million pagodas, it's called. It was one of apparently 100,000 pagodas that were commissioned by the Empress in Japan in the 750s. There are only a small number now surviving, and there's one in the Chester Beatty, and the Dharani is a little Buddhist prayer. So this is a little tiny little pagoda about so tall, but the stupa, the little top comes off, and the rolled up inside it was one of the earliest forms of printing, one of the early, well, certainly in Japan, one of the earliest mass printed things was this little Buddhist script, this little Buddhist prayer. That's inside it. So that's something else that's very, very special. And I think a lot of people might know that. Yeah.
It's a familiar piece. And I was actually, I was only telling Fionnuala there in a conversation earlier this week that my own dad does a bit of wood turning, and your team had really very kindly given him kind of incredible access to actually just get to see it and kind of help with the process. So
well, it's an incredible replica he produced. So the skills are alive and well. The same skills from the 8th century.
Yeah, well, it'll be lovely to hear that. But just looking at some of the comments that we have coming in here this evening, with Eugene saying, it's both my favourite places in Dublin represented tonight. That's lovely. Thank you very much. And then a question from Ben. Your favourite thing about being the director of the Chester Beatty?
The favorite thing about being director, well, whatever about being director, I think my favorite thing in what really, I think it drives anybody working with a collection really, is the huge privilege. You know, you love your collection. I think that goes for everybody working in the museum. That is what, you know, this sort of what the quality we all share is, that really everybody working in the museum works for the collection in one way, perhaps on the visitor side or perhaps on the collection side, but that really is at the core of it. And I have to say, I've been really fortunate throughout my career that I've had this sort of really privileged access to some of the most beautiful things in existence. And on the hardest of days when you might be stuck in paperwork and whatever else might be, you might forget the raison d'etre for working in a museum. And then, you know, you pop up to the conservation lab and something special has been taken out to be worked on or to be assessed for an exhibition. And, you know, that little spark of joy comes into your life again when you see something just really beautiful and exceptional.
It's, I think you captured it quite beautifully there. So thank you for that kind of honest insight. And I guess you're talking about having access to getting to see these incredible works up close and personal. And obviously at this particular moment in time, none of us are getting to see too many museums and galleries as we're closed kind of on public health guidelines. But you know, when you do reopen, hopefully in the weeks ahead, you do have an exhibition called Siam running at the moment.
We do. We have Siam through the lens of John Thompson, which was originally due to close, I think, in May, if I'm not mistaken. And one of the earliest decisions we made in March was, let's take what pressure we can off ourselves, let's control what we can on this uncontrolled time. So we decided, and with the kind agreement of the lenders of the exhibition, to extend Siam through the lens right up to the end of this year. And John Thompson was one of the earliest travel photographers, if you like, a Scottish photographer who set off to travel through Asia in the 1860s, arriving in Bangkok in 1865. And, you know, he wasn't with a formal mission. He wasn't on a, you know, he wasn't part of a government or a state visit or something like that. He kind of went on his own, obviously had great people skills. And what he did was he photographed the court of King Mongkut, who is, you know, everybody knows the king out of The King and I, or and the King, a progressive king, one of the first really progressive kings in Thailand who built up links with Europe. But he just, some of these extraordinary portraits at the court, they're some of the most striking images, but early images of landscape and activities that are happening around the court. Angkor Wat was under Thai rule at the time, and he got a letter from the king to give him access there to photograph there as well. And these were all onto, it's called these were all onto glass negatives. When this lady Betty Yao, who's the co-curator of the exhibition, when she found these in the Wellcome Library and printed them, had them reproduced for display, did so that they're on a very large scale. And, you know, two things to say about that. One, the technique lasted onto big scale, really works on big scale, but also makes a really big impact. So that exhibition is going to stay up until just over Christmas, and we hope to be open again soon. It's been sporadic, but that'll bring us up to January.
Okay, yeah, I think we're all slightly at the mercy of how the dates unfold in the weeks, but I haven't seen it myself, so hopefully before Christmas, as you said.
Definitely worth a visit, really very much so.
And it's an amazing thing to think that images that were taken such a long period ago are still capable of being blown up to such scale, like the quality of the craftsmanship.
It's in no doubt whatsoever. I think, and I think photographers today really would regard him with awe, because the amount of equipment that would have had to be carried around, obviously with help, he would have had significant helpers. You need it to be, I think, physically in good shape, let alone have a good eye. Yeah.
And then, so come January, all going to plan, you have a new exhibition due to open called Edo in Colour. I think it's February that's due to go up. Do you want to
yes.
A little bit?
That is, sorry, just for the dates there are, that's 5th of February, all going well, that's going to open on the 5th of February. And I can say a few words on that. Actually, it brings us back around to Beatty coming to Dublin, because Beatty, as I said, continued to collect right into the 50s, 1950s and 1960s. And by this stage, he's in his early 90s, in the early, late 80s, let's say, in the early 60s. So we have about 800 Japanese prints. I talked about the scrolls and paints, but about 800 Japanese prints in the collection. And these were acquired after the move to Ireland between 1954 and 1963 kind of time. Of those 800, 400 or plus are what we call surimono. Now, by that I mean these were privately commissioned prints, produced in relatively small numbers, maybe for a book club, something like that, or to celebrate a particular festival. All the finest artists were used for them. And some people will remember we had an exhibition of the surimono called The Art of Friendship a few years ago. And we had 140,000 visitors for that, which tells me what an appetite there is for this kind of material. So my colleague, the same curator, Mary Redfern, our East Asian curator, is now working on Edo in Colour, which is showing the city of Edo, Tokyo, as we call it today, how the commercially produced prints, the other prints, the commercially mass-produced prints from mainly the 18th century, also some 19th century, how they captured this bustling metropolis of Edo and its people and its activities and its scenery.
And so if you're saying that these are slightly more kind of commercially or larger scale in their production at the time, like who would they have been consumed, or how would they have been consumed at the time?
By the public. They were literally for sale. They would be sold in print shops or print stalls for the public. So a publisher would commission the artist and the printmaker, whoever would do up the wood blocks from the artist's drawings or sketchings, and they were produced and they developed and they became refined in response to the public taste. So they knew what the public wanted. So it might be actors from the theatre who were very recognised figures, and possibly striking a pose or dressed in the costume of whatever famous pose it was, which say the Kabuki theatre, which would have been so popular and well known. Or it could have been, the great beauties of the day. And of course, one of those paragons of beauty, and one section of the exhibition will focus on the licensed prostitution district, the Shin Yoshiwara. I hope I've remembered that quickly, or is it Yoshiwari? Yes, these prints of the prostitutes as great sort of high-ranking companions that people could only aspire to sharing their company. They could share their company through prints, but of course the prints then also masked some of the less attractive realities of that life. And then Mount Fuji, the famous Mount Fuji, is another section of that exhibition. Fuji, that of course has a legendary role in the history of the city.
Okay, and then how would woodblock printing have worked at that time in terms of artistic ownership? Is it that there was a couple of key artists, there was production houses, or?
Well, there were production houses. The publisher, as I say, would have commissioned. And he commissioned the artists that and in this exhibition, the great names that we know, the Hiroshige and Hokusai, Utamaro, all these artists, and paid them, and paid the producers, the print producers as well, and they would have made the profit from the sales. I was just talking to Mary about it earlier today. I was saying to her, how many would they have printed? And I suppose it was interesting that you should ask me that, Sarah. Actually, I didn't know you were going to ask me that, but you're saying, unfortunately, we know very little about the economics of the production of these prints. Accounts haven't survived to look at, but I mean, they could produce up to 7,000 of a really popular print. And of course, when you think of it, the woodblock was going to wear out after I don't know how many hundreds. So they get a new woodblock made. And sometimes another publisher would buy that famous image from the previous publisher, and he would start to produce it, and you only know because you have the publisher's print, and the new publisher would have his stamp, I should say, on the print as well. And so there's a lot of connoisseurship required in sort of tracing these back to the original production.
But it sounds like there was definitely commercial sense in it as a...
Oh yes, absolutely. Yes, they were tremendously popular. People would paste them up on the walls at home, or they might buy an album and start pasting, a series of images into the album, I suppose like a nice scrapbook that we would think of.
Yeah, it's a beautiful idea. And I see someone here is asking, do we know, would there be many of these prints still around? Have many survived if they're being produced on that scale?
Very hard to know. I asked the very same question, funnily enough. I asked Mary the same question, and really hard to know. And I suppose one thing I can say is that those that survive, of course, a different sort of condition. And bringing it back to Beatty, to say that he used a specialist called Jack Hillier to help him to find prints of really good condition and quality. Always with Beatty, this always comes back to that as well. So, I don't know, and I don't know if anybody has sort of done or even can tell how many would survive. If, let's say, 7,000 were done, how many have survived to this day? I mean, the surimono being so much rarer are so much rarer, and so few have survived. And there are surimono that are only known in one particular collection, as in perhaps in the Chester Beatty collection or another collection. But these undoubtedly, they may have been mass produced, and of course most of them, they were quite disposable as well, because they weren't expensive, or relatively expensive. They would have been, so many would have just got lost, and also the fragility of the paper, and as I'm saying, pasted on walls of houses, put into scrapbooks, not necessarily framed and considered that they were going to be held in museums.
Which is fair enough in terms of the kind of the using function that they would have had at that particular moment. But it sounds like it's going to be a really aesthetically...
It's going to be a beautiful exhibition. It's going to run right through from February to the end of August next year. And Mary's doing a rotation right in the middle. We're going to close for a week. So 50 prints from the first showing, and then a rotation and a new 50 prints. So worth a second visit. Yeah, and you know, even we might be talking about the numbers of them being printed and mass produced, but let there be no doubt about the sort of the aesthetic richness of these images, and the interpretation of them as social history documents as well is absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, I can't wait. And actually, when you're talking about kind of the social aspect of it, I found myself just going onto your website there during the week and looking up the mission of the Chester Beatty as you articulate it. And you know, one of the sentences that I took from it was this idea that intercultural learning and dialogue is very much at the heart of all of your exhibition and learning programs. Could you unpack that a little bit for me and just talk to me about those ambitions?
Yes, I suppose this is something that's really an aspect that the Chester Beatty has been able to build on since the move to Dublin Castle as well, because with the establishment of the education department in the current location, and it also led to the establishment of our intercultural learning programme. And you know, I grew up in pretty much a monocultural society, and certainly the Ireland that Beatty knew and was living in throughout the 50s and 60s was very monocultural, and Ireland has become much more diverse in recent decades. And I think I'm absolutely certain that the collection has taken on a new relevance because of this. Are you drinking Santa Rita wine, Sarah? Is that what you're doing?
I'm drinking Dublin's finest tap water, but I'm
very good.
Later on.
So back to our intercultural program. So you know, really it's taken on a relevance. And what I mean really by that is that we sought to, through our displays, through our activities, through our public programs, we've sought to enhance our visitors' understanding of the cultures represented in the collections. And I often think, you know, that a visit to the Chester Beatty for somebody might be their first introduction to a culture like Islam or Hinduism or Jainism or whatever other faith or culture we might be talking about. And we've done that in many different ways. I mean, I'll give you one example that I think is just a really strong, I can give you as many examples as we have time for, but one really strong example I think is that, and I'm going back a good few years, back about 7 years to about 2013, when we introduced our community ambassador program. So this meant that we asked, these are in Japanese and Mandarin and in Arabic. So we asked members of those communities to become tour guides in their native language. And this not only, if you like, meant that they would bring their own insights and understandings of the collections they're presenting in Japanese or Mandarin or in Arabic, but also then they act as mediators between the museum and those communities. So our head of education has really, really consciously from the beginning sought to build bridges between the museum and those newer communities that have come to settle in Ireland. Mm. You could name whatever, you know, the Thai community, the Chinese, the Japanese community, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, it's a gorgeous idea, and it's wonderful to hear the success that it's had in recent years since being founded and set up as an initiative. And I know one body of work that you took on in the Chester Beatty, I think it was 2016, that is something that we in the little museum think about and talk about a lot, was this idea of attempting to actually articulate what the role of a museum is in unpicking and kind of peeling back what cultural identity actually looks like. Would you talk to us a little bit about that?
We did, and I suppose if I go back in my own mind to 1916 and all the museums and all the cultural institutions around the country were thinking of ways to commemorate the 1916 Rising and not having much Irish material, that not being our remit and our focus. Well, we talked and we came about to talk about what did it mean to be Irish in 2016. 100 years later. And in fact, we held an international symposium on the role of national museums, I think, I'm trying to remember, the role of national museums in renegotiating identity. And I suppose if we just sort of pare that away to the essence, take out anything fancy, what do we actually mean? Well, we go to a museum, and a national museum, and we see objects that reflect us as an Irish person. We go to the National Museum, and of course we see the objects that were the photographs in our history books, or at least in my history books, which were going back before yours. But you know, the Book of Kells from Trinity, of course, but the Ardagh chalice, the Tara brooch, etc., etc. And I think we're very conscious that, you know, having a sort of a multicultural society requires new narratives. Mm. And in the Chester Beatty, we're very conscious of that, and conscious that with the collections, we can present new narratives. People can see their culture and objects that refer back in their minds to their sense of identity in our collections. And that's, I suppose, maybe I'm not explaining it in a terribly refined way, but there's a lot to unpick there. And, you know, I think we're at early stages in Ireland at looking at that. And I'll be very honest with you, we had an extraordinary lineup of speakers in 2013, but it didn't get the attention that all the other things that were happening got, that were just so much more directly related to 1916. But you know, it's there, and it stands testimony to the fact that we do this and we think in this way. And I'm hearing that language now beginning to be used more generally in other national cultural institutions that I would meet with regularly, and that's really encouraging.
Yeah, and I think this kind of the role of museums in kind of identity is something that it is being discussed even with, say, the Museums Association and so forth, kind of on a slightly wider scale, which is only going to be a positive thing. Really
encouraging, yeah.
But when you were talking there about how this body of research and fostering these conversations informed or kind of, you know, provoked your thinking around some of the curatorial decisions that you guys were making in the Chester Beatty. Like, I'm right in thinking it's only 2 or 3% of your collection that you ever actually have on public display. So could you talk me through a little bit about what the process of deciding what sorts of pieces make their way into your permanent exhibitions or temporary exhibitions, what that process is like?
Yes, it's a small amount. It's a small amount, and it's not, I suppose, unusual in being such a small amount either, but it's only about 2.5%. It goes up when we have a temporary exhibition, like a special exhibition, like having 50 Japanese prints out. The galleries there are 2 established themes at present. We have 2 floors of permanent galleries, the Arts of the Book and the Sacred Art Gallery. So within those 2 frameworks, the curators create minor themes, if you like, themes within those bigger themes. So they have just, the material also dictates to the extent that the material needs resting. And much of what we have is obviously in a medium that is very terribly fragile, whether it be palm leaf or papyrus or early paper or whatever. And it needs to be shown for restricted periods of time. So we try to ideally rotate everything within a year, that nothing would be out for longer, and then rest it for multiple years. Mm-hmm. So that in itself, you know, will dictate how frequently something can be shown. And there are favorites that sort of people always want to see, and we're very much aware of that. But, you know, the curators sometimes it will reflect their own research, or they'll find a subsection within their own collections that they want to develop. And it may be something that they're writing a paper on or contributing to in an international exhibition or whatever. And they will, or perhaps it may coincide with something that's happening in terms of a wider anniversary of something. And they will select works around that and build little sub-themes, little sub-displays within the permanent galleries. What's been really nice for them, it really arose out of financial restrictions, not having the monies to bring in major loans, led us to start to really focus on producing really high quality special displays like Edo, like the Art of Friendship, like the other exhibitions coming down the line, from our permanent collection, like Thai Buddhist tales. And so it means that they really have an almost, well, of course it's finite, but an almost infinite selection of things, of ideas, of areas that they can develop from the permanent collection and bring out. So after Edo, if I may just say, our curator of the Islamic collections is now working very hard on her research for an exhibition to follow Edo on Safavid Isfahan. Okay. Which became sort of the Isfahan becoming the capital of the Safavid Safavids from the late 16th century. And we have extraordinary beautiful material that I think won't be so familiar to a lot of people, and certainly not in the context of an exhibition just focusing on that theme.
Oh, wonderful. Well, that's that'll be looking forward to. You saying the Edo runs till August, so the end of
yeah, Edo runs till then, so I had to write down exhibition dates because I have a head like a sieve. The Isfahan is due to open in October next year and run through to the following April.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, so that's to look forward to. It's and I see Kathy has written in a question here asking if you consider twinning with, she's given the example of the Lafcadio Hearn Museum in Matsuo in Japan, but I wonder, do you do much international collaboration in terms of?
We do a lot of international collaboration, and my colleagues are all very well interconnected with colleagues around the globe in various academic institutions and museums. We lend, normally, not in COVID times, but we lend to international exhibitions all over the world, to all the major museums in the world as well. We welcome scholars. We're members of sort of international communities like the Asia-Europe Museum Network. We're very active internationally. And that's terribly important to us, to any museum, but it's really terribly important to us. What I'd say on the Lafcadio Hearn, and everybody automatically thinks of Chester Beatty, and we don't actually have any Lafcadio Hearn material in the Chester Beatty, but we did have an exhibition many years ago, and we've had many dealings with the Lafcadio Hearn, let's say, down through the years. Yeah.
The rather funny thing is we actually did an exhibition on Lafcadio Hearn in the little museum, about 4 or 5 years ago. And
right.
The Lafcadio Hearn Museum over in Japan was incredible. They sent us over a couple of pieces to display within it, and it was one of the more interesting kind of collaborations we've ever had, traveling or dealing with kind of partners so far away, because we're obviously far more local in the grand scheme. But I see.
Is that when his grandson came over? Was that big at the time you were doing the exhibition?
That was
Ben Koizumi. Yeah.
That's when the garden opened in Tullamore.
That's right. That's right.
I think they were about a month before us that the garden opened, but the two events tied into an anniversary, which I can't remember the exact date off the top of my mind, but there was a milestone in his narrative that was met at that point. And it was an amazing story. It was a wonderful one for the children's education program. We had great fun with it, but there was one question being asked here from, speaking of international, Ava, who's joining us from Toronto, which is lovely to hear. They're saying, I noticed the collections are classified by 3 categories: places, world faith, and materials and techniques. She's just wondering about, what the thought process went into determining those categories.
Oh, I think she's pulling those from the website, and I think that they were classifications that the collections team were using to group objects, if you like, and introduce people, bring people pathways into the collections through the website. But they're just suggestions and one way, if you like, as well. I mean, another way you could say we classify, but again, it's really on pragmatic grounds. We only have 3 curatorial posts. As I think I've said to you, Sarah, this collection could support probably 50 curators. But anyway, and so for convenience, we have, a European curator, which covers everything from early, Egyptian papyrus up to 20th century artist books, and a curator for Islamic collections, a curator for East Asian, And you know, the East Asian alone covering everything from China, Japan, down right into Southeast Asia. So there are many ways, and yes, those are on the website, and they're lovely ways to sort of give people suggestions on ways to engage with the collection online.
I would dare speculate that your three curators have entirely fascinating jobs. I can only imagine what must be entailed, but
well, yes, I think overwhelming also might be the word. Especially as we're digitizing collections at the moment as well. That's
which is an amazing thing, and the idea that we'll all be able to access imagery from the collection online is really quite exciting, something to look forward to, and something that I was trying to ask you the other day, and I think I was failing to get the words, and hopefully I won't do the same now, but when you're looking at different communities in overlapping time periods, were there kind of commonalities of kind of the shared human experience and kind of key kind of overlapping traits that you saw throughout different environments that, you know, the collection depicts?
Yes, if I understand you correctly, yes. And you know, I suppose when you're working with a collection like ours that's reflecting so many different cultures across the world and really focusing on a global artistic heritage, you do at times really begin to focus more on our shared human heritage, if you like. I mean, I can give you one example of that was always sort of a bit of a standout in a way for me. And if I'm not answering your question, let me know. But some people will remember we did an exhibition called A to Z, Chester Beatty's A to Z, about, I don't know, 2014, 2015, something like that. And A was for amulets. It was just another way you talk about the website classifications. The A to Z was almost another way just to bring people in. A was for amulets, B was for Beatty, you know, C for calligraphy. But it really, often because, you know, curators have such huge remits themselves, as we've already said, they may not know what's in another curator's collection. That's not necessarily, unless there's some overlap they're working on. And we really realized that we had amulets. We had such a wide, diverse variety of amulets right across the collections, you know. We have Christian amulets and Jewish amulets, Hindu and Islamic amulets, and we had an Ethiopic amulet that I remember that was made for a Muslim woman called Gamila with an image of an archangel and a text from the St. John's Gospel. And really all of this sort of underpinned, I think just in one display case, I know the moment sort of hit me where really we were looking at sort of a universality of human belief in a greater power that could somehow protect them and help them, regardless of where in the world people were coming from. And you'll hear there are other people will say this as well, but really, it's just so nice to look for those shared moments.
It's a beautiful example. It really, really is. And I wonder. I'm not sure why, but this is a question I'm always just fascinated to know the answer when talking to keepers of collections. I wonder if you would have one key piece in the collection that the piece that has your heart.
Yeah, that one's actually really easy for me to answer, and I always say the same thing. It's the Ibn al-Bawwab Quran. We have some of the. Again, somebody else said it, which is much better. I remember the curator in the Louvre in Abu Dhabi. The chief curator there said, everybody knows that the best Qurans in the world are in the Chester Beatty, which is terribly nice to hear. But we have some really special, beautiful, beautiful Qurans. And the Ibn al-Bawwab, I mentioned the Roots Bahan, which is one of our most lavishly illuminated Qurans. The Ibn al-Bawwab is a little Quran about this size. It's modest, it's not ostentatious. It's called the Ibn al-Bawwab because the calligrapher and illuminator is a man called Ibn al-Bawwab, the son of the doorkeeper, and it's produced in Baghdad in the year 1000. And I am no expert on this area, and to any experts listening, my apologies if I don't describe it in the most appropriate historical terms, but it just captured my heart, yes, from the first time I saw it. And it has been on display quite a lot. Actually, it was on display in the Gift of a Lifetime exhibition, which a lot of people might remember, which was celebrating 50 years of Beatty's gift. Yes, it hasn't been out because of that. It's just not out at the moment, I don't believe. Yeah.
As you said, it needs its couple of years and then in due course. And I guess that leads me to ask what the future looks like for the Chester Beatty.
Yes, well, I suppose back to, we've been jumping around a little bit, but back to sort of what I said early on. We have reached a point of 370,000 visitors in a normal year, and of course the building alone is finding that difficult. The collection is ever more known, both here in Ireland and internationally. Its profile has grown, but the collections themselves have always been known to those interested in each of the aspects that we have in the collection. We need to upgrade and improve just about every service that we have to just provide a better visitor experience, a safer environment for the collections. I mean, safer in terms of sort of conservation and environmentally. We need more space for services like conservation, digital photography. But above all, what we really, really want to have is, those who know us know we have a very modest special exhibition gallery. It's just sort of a large room area. And we are we're working on a Chester Beatty expansion plan. And really a key element of that, whatever form it takes, and we're at early days, I hope, the big intention is to have a good sized temporary exhibition gallery that will allow us to develop themes. We really are the only museum in Ireland that's presenting significant exhibitions of, if I may say, a non-Western, non-European themes, developing really other themes. And, when I say 140,000 for Art of Friendship, for example, that's just one that always sticks in my mind. We know there's a huge appetite and a huge appreciation for the exhibitions that we're putting on. And the other thing is, of course, we're huge lenders. We're significant lenders, not huge lenders, but we lend significantly to exhibitions internationally. And, sometimes we have the opportunity to collaborate and bring an exhibition back, and we simply don't have the infrastructure and the space to do that. So there are huge opportunities there to develop. And that's where we're looking to go.
That's exciting. I think from what you've explained about Beatty as a person, I think there's a certain quality and there's a certain kind of caliber of what you have to achieve. So it'll be really interesting to see what the expansion in the future of it looks like. And I know I'll be greatly enthusiastic to watch that grow. But the only other thing I'm going to ask you about this evening, because we are running kind of somehow, it's been one of the quicker hours I've ever had.
Thank you.
It's I just want to ask about conservation. Like, as you said, Beatty by his nature would have gone to collect pieces that were in very good condition, but you are dealing with incredibly old, incredibly delicate, incredibly rare pieces. What does conservation in the Chester Beatty look like?
Yes, so we have a small but highly skilled team of conservators. We have our head of conservation, and we have a book conservator, and we have a Heritage Council intern working with us, which we're always delighted for. And so it's a small team, and it's a very, very busy little hub, because when you think about it, everything, whether a work is destined for, whether it's been requested for research purposes by a scholar who's come to visit us, whether it's due for rotation in a permanent gallery or in the temporary display, whether it's due for digitization, or whatever the purpose, it always goes through the conservation lab. It may just be literally to check its handling is safe, or to check or to assess it for exhibition and display. They're just so terribly busy. And on top of all of that, they work on special projects that, you know, with agreed objectives, obviously, on special projects on like the Roots Behan Quran that I mentioned, that couldn't really safely be displayed because it had been rebound so badly in latter years. And I mean, when I say latter years, probably in the 19th century or early 20th, something like that. But, you know, so it's a busy place, and we have paper specialist skills and specialist book conservation and also specialist manuscript conservation skills in the department. So we're very fortunate, and that's absolutely a crucial element of our operation.
It sounds like it. It's yeah, it's an amazing place. It's been really wonderful as someone who's spent, you know, I would say approaching 3 figures worth of visits to the Chester Beatty since I was, you know, whatever, yay high child. So it's been an absolute pleasure to sit here and to listen to you. So I guess I would keep asking you questions all evening, but I'm going to instead just say sincerely thank you so much for being here this evening. I see someone, Kathy, wrote in saying thank you for the wonderful conversation. It's great to see the collection is in such safe hands, and I think that kind of
thank you so much. I know we jumped around and we've hopped around, and but you know, another time we'll focus in a little more on things. But also that website is really good for anyone who wants to know more about Beatty himself as well, you know.
Wonderful, and we will hopefully, when we return to some semblance of normalcy, we'll arrange a members trip for the little museums team.
Yes.
So I would very much enjoy that. So we'll
please do
that. But I guess for now, that is it for another evening of 120 Dublin Stories with Santa Rita and the Little Museum. So once again, just saying very sincere thanks to Fionnuala Croke, the director of Chester Beatty, for joining us, and to all of you who've been here this evening as well, and for asking questions. Thank you so much, and good evening.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's great. Thanks. Bye-bye.